Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lars Schall. I am a freelance journalist from Germany, and I am now connected in Washington, D.C. in the United States with U.S. lawyer J. Michael Springmann. Hello, Mike.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
Okay, I'm quite pleased to be interviewed by you, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
You have published a book last year, and its title is Visas for al-Qaeda, CIA Handouts That Rock the World. The book deals with your personal experiences as the chief of the visa section at the U.S. Embassy in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. First of all, how did you end up there?
Well, that's what I sort of wondered myself. When I joined the State Department, after assignments with the Foreign Commercial Service and the State Commerce Exchange Program, which provided Washington assignments for State Department officials and foreign assignments for civil servants at the Commerce Department, we were bidding on various positions around the world based on our knowledge, our experience, if any, language skills, language knowledge, and so forth. And I picked a number of places. East Berlin was one, some places in Africa and India, and I don't know where else. But Saudi Arabia was never on my list of places I want to be sent. And yet, the day they were passing out assignments, I was given the green flag of Saudi Arabia and travel orders to go there as chief of the visa section at the American Consulate General in Jeddah, in the Hijaz in western Saudi Arabia. And when I asked the guy who was running the educational program called A100, which introduced new foreign service officers to the State Department and the rest of the American government, I said, John Tasic, what exactly was going on? Because I had been told by my career development officer, the woman who was supposedly going to guide my career in the State Department, that I was going to be sent to East Berlin because the European Bureau wanted me there. And the way the State Department works, the European Bureau is primus inter pares. What the European Bureau wants, the European Bureau gets. So I was flabbergasted, and he said, well, they were looking, he didn't know either. And I went off to one of the people who had conducted some of these education sessions, whose name, regrettably, I don't remember, and asked him. And I said, well, they wanted somebody a little bit older. They wanted somebody with commercial experience. Jeddah's a major mercantile hub in the kingdom, and they thought you'd be perfect for the job, which really didn't answer my questions and probably raised a few more that I would have loved to have had answered.
Yeah, but actually you ended up there. And
yeah.
What happened when you worked as the chief of the visa section at the U.S. Embassy in Jeddah? Between 1987 and 1989, I should say.
That's right, yeah. Well, let me tell you, I've got to give you some background on this. I was in language training in Arabic and area studies, talking to me about what Saudi Arabia and the Middle East is like, giving you background on culture and things like this. And I got a call from the State Department, or one of the State Department desk officers for Saudi Arabia. These are people that follow the political, economic, commercial, and social interests in a country. They're kind of the country's ambassadors in Washington. They interpret the given country to the rest of the State Department. And the guy said the American ambassador, Walter Cutler, was in town, and did I want to meet him? And I said, yeah, sure. And I figured this was a hello and goodbye session that might last all of 5 minutes. Hi, I'm going to go out to Jeddah, join your official family, and so forth. Well, he kept me there for 45 minutes talking about all the problems my predecessor, Greta Holtz, had created for the embassy in Riyadh. She was not issuing visas to all of these rich Saudi women who couldn't travel without hairdressers and seamstresses and other factotums. And I figured when he was doing this for 45 minutes, he was telling me something, but I had no idea what the message was. And when I asked the guy, the desk officer who sat through the meeting with me, what this was about, and he said, I don't know, Cutler's just a queer duck. welcomed with open arms. I had previously written my predecessor, Greta Holtz, and she never responded to any of the 3 letters I had sent her, asking about the job, what it was like at the consulate, what it was like living in Saudi Arabia. And I'm welcomed with open arms by the Consul General, J. Freres, the political officer, Henry Enscher, and was told, oh, you're such an improvement over Greta. She was a real bitch. She was nothing but a troublemaker. We're glad you're here. And I said, oh, she'll make my day. She'll make my career. And after a while, I was refusing visas because the idea between the law and regulation in the United States is that someone applying for a visa has to be considered an intending immigrant unless and until he can prove otherwise. And the burden of proof is on him. You've got to show ties like a job or property or family, or you're going to class at a university or something. So these were people that had no real job, no real existence in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, one of them, a Sudanese guy, was a refugee from the Sudan and unemployed in Saudi Arabia. And I refused these characters. And Freres and other people would round on me and demand to know why I had said that they can't have a visa. And I said they have no ties, like law and regulation says they must. And it got to where they were telling me to do this. And it wasn't, it's your decision. It's, if you want to keep your job in the State Department, you'll issue the visa to this particular person. In the case of the Sudanese guy, for example, Henry Enscher's successor, Karen Sasahara, wanted the visa but wouldn't tell me why. So she went to the head of the consular section, Justice, whose given name, Stevens, and got the visa issued. I asked Justice afterwards, well, what was it that she needed the visa for? And he just says national security, which has no real meaning, and wouldn't go any farther. There were 2 other people. They were, I think, Pakistanis. They were going to an American trade show, but couldn't name the trade show and didn't know what city it was going to be held in. And I refused them. And Paul Arvid Tveit, TVEIT, who is listed on namebase.org as a CIA official and is now living as a retired person in Virginia, went to Justice Stevens after arguing with me about it and again got these guys visas. And this is, kind of a microcosm of what went on for the 18 months I was there. It was a daily battle. And when I talked to Jean Bradford, she was the head of the Citizen Services branch of the consular section, dealing with Americans needing passports or being jailed or something like this. Oh, she says, Jay Freres, he just likes giving candy to babies, which was, again, no real answer.
Yeah. Okay, so you opposed this, and how did that play out?
Well, I went to Justice about this, and he said, well, keep quiet and issue the visas. I went to Stephanie Smith, whom namebase.org also says worked for the CIA. She was the counselor for consular affairs in Riyadh. And I told her about this, and she said, well, yeah, it really is bad. You should talk to the Bureau of Consular Affairs the next time you're in Washington. And she had come down and sent one of her people, Bob Mustaine, to come down and talk about this. And they actually really wouldn't do anything about it. And when they had an inspection team come out, these are people that are sent by the Inspector General's office to make sure that the various Foreign Service posts are well managed, well organized, operating according to law and regulation. This guy, what's his name now? Oh, geez, I can't remember. It's in the book. He came to me and said, look, you know that this is going on. Can you tell me about this, the problems with the visas? And I said, well, I was told by a good contact, Nestor Martin, not to talk to the inspection team, because if I did, I would be fired. And the guy, Joseph P. O'Neill, the inspector, said, well, I know all about this, and told me things I hadn't known myself. and say, come on, tell me, I'll protect you. I mean, this is confidential. It's like talking to a priest, like talking to an attorney. I'm silent on this. So eventually, after an hour, he wore me down. And I told him. And then Freres wrote me this vicious efficiency report right afterwards that would guarantee almost that I would be thrown out of the Foreign Service. And O'Neill had a very peculiar background. He had his own problems with the Inspection Corps. He had said he'd gotten his job, according to an interview with Georgetown University, in Khartoum in the Sudan as Deputy Chief of Mission, Deputy Ambassador, through Frank Wisner of the famous CIA family, the Wisner family. And I thought this was peculiar. I learned later on that O'Neill had been Deputy Chief of Mission when the blind Sheikh Omar Abdulrahman got his visa to come to the United States through one of the CIA officials working undercover in the consular section. He also mentioned in the report to Georgetown that another CIA agent also got a free pass visa to come to the States, but he didn't say any more about it. He'd also been assigned to Tehran when the Iranian students took over the embassy the first time. And while he was there, according to the interview with Georgetown, he worked to help the Israeli embassy evacuate their staff, but he opposed evacuating the American embassy and in fact fought with the political section who wanted to contact Washington and say, we really need to evacuate the embassy or we're going to have some real political problems with Iran. And I wrote him later on when he was Consul General in Bermuda, and he never explained what went on in Jeddah. And he went on to various assignments after he had retired from the Foreign Service in Central Asia. And I don't know whether he was working with the Arab Afghans then, because he seemed to be defending them in Jeddah, I guess. All right, well, I'd written to people in Jeddah. I'd written to Jay Freres, to Henry Ensher, to Andy Weber, who was a supposed part-time consular officer in the visa section. He's now Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. I'd written to Greta Holtz, my predecessor, who's now the American ambassador to Oman. Ensher is also American ambassador to Algeria. And all of these people never responded. I'd written Justice Stevens, and all he ever said was, well, no, there were no questions, there were no problems with visas in Jeddah, which was basically not true.
Yeah. To make a long story short, you ultimately lost your job.
That's right.
What was the reason you tried to find it out?
Well, yeah, they never told me. I tried under the Freedom of Information Act to find out why and asked for all the documents relating to my service with the State Department, in particular why I was fired. And all I ever got was travel orders, copies of pay stubs, copies of efficiency reports that I already had. And I kept going back to them saying, this is what I want. I don't need pay stubs. I need the deliberations of the tenuring board. I need the explanations of why I supposedly didn't measure up to the rest of the people in the State Department, including the troublemaker Greta Holtz, who was thoroughly despised, I was told, by State Department officials. I never got a response. So I sued them in 1992, 1993, thereabouts. And never got anything more. I got more useless paper, nothing substantial. And eventually, this judge, Harold H. Green, who supposedly was a refugee from Nazi Germany, he sealed my lawsuit as a threat to national security. And I've never been able to figure out why finding out why you were fired is a threat to national security. After some time, I asked for what I probably should have asked for at the beginning, copies of all these visa applications that I had denied and that Freres and others had approved. This was something that I had made copies of when I was in Jeddah and neglected to take with me. And I found out later that these copies had somehow mysteriously been destroyed. They were shredded. So I said, I want these. They were copies. The State Department keeps copies. They're supposed to get rid of them yearly, but when I was in Jeddah, we had filing cases bulging with old visa applications, 5, 10, maybe 15 years old, that nobody had shredded, even though they were required to. And my staff said, Mike, we have two choices. We can work for you and deal with the 100 to 200 people who apply for a visa every day, process the paperwork, do the name checks on them with Washington, or we can shred visas. What do you want us to do? We can't do both. So I told this to the court. I put this in an affidavit when the state kept insisting that the visas were gone, and it was ignored. In fact, the judge asked me to give him the names of the 45,000 applicants a year for the visas, which is absolute nonsense. So I then asked the State Department, all right, you shredded the visas. When were they shredded? Who did them? What was their name? What was their rank? And so forth. Never got anything back other than we shredded them. It was done according to regulations. That's all we can tell you. And as Nick Pope, this official in the British Ministry of Defense, remarked one time, in a big organization, you can always lose something gets misfiled, whatever. But when you're dealing with national security issues, when you're dealing with the government agencies, dealing with foreign affairs, this doesn't happen. And if it does, then there's something really strange going on.
Now, in your book, you suggest that the U.S. Embassy in Jeddah was in fact a CIA base.
Oh, it was. It was.
Tell us, please. Tell us, please, what points into that direction.
Sure. Well, the consulate had about 20 Americans assigned there. And of the 20 Americans, thereabouts, there were only 3 people, including myself, that I knew for certainty to have no ties with any of the intelligence services, either as a staff member or a family member. Lonnie Washington was the only State Department communicator, and Jim Page, an administrative officer, was the only guy in the administrative section that I thought worked for State.
How was there the suspicion that the other guys were working on a different payroll?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like Jay Freres, for example, the East German journalist Julius Mader had written that he worked for the CIA. I know a retired European diplomat that isn't quite sure, but he says if he didn't work for the agency, he was what you could call, I guess, a fellow traveler, somebody who did the CIA's bidding.
Mm-hmm. And the State Department is used to give the CIA or NSA agents cover?
I mean, you had, Eric Qualkenbush, the CIA base chief there in Jeddah. He was, his cover was head of the political economics section. Henry Encher and Karen Sasahara, I'm pretty sure, worked for the CIA. Qualkenbush at one time took me aside on the compound and said, Mike, we've got this Iranian agent we want in Washington. We really need him there for consultations. Make it look good. Wink, wink. He's coming in for a visa interview tomorrow. Well, I was surprised at this. And when the Iranian guy came to the visa window, he had been to the United States several times before and always come back. He had stamps in the passport to prove it. He had a letter showing that he was an official with this Oriental Rug Company in Jeddah. It was a family-owned business. He had a list of people he was going to visit in the United States as potential customers or as old customers he wanted to consult with. It was basically a clean interview, and he answered all my questions to my satisfaction. And I thought, geez, give me more people like him. And to this day, I have no idea why Qualkenbush didn't tell me about the other people that were being sent to me. It would have been a lot simpler, a lot easier. And at the time, I was dumb enough to probably have said, all right, you want to recruit these guys for the Afghan war against the Soviets. I work for the American government. You work for the American government. I trust my government. I'll issue the visas. But they never did. I don't know whether this was stupidity, bureaucracy, or They thought I had been told about what was going on by Walter Cutler in Washington, and I just simply refused to get along with the program. I had no idea.
What did you learn about the whole operation in Jeddah later on, and how?
Sure. Well, later on, I was floundering, trying to find a job. I was unemployed for 3 years, and eventually found out I had been blackballed by the State Department. But I was researching an article I was trying to get published on the Middle East, and ran across this journalist, Joe Trento, who's in Washington, follows national security issues, and has written a couple of books on it. And Joe found out that I had been in Jeddah, and when I was in Jeddah, and wanted to talk to me. And I went and saw him in his office, and he said, well, you know, what you were doing, you were a patsy, one of the ones they sent up from Washington, hoping that nobody would ask questions and give a free pass to all these recruits for the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets. And I said, really? And he said, well, look at it this way. You refused all these people that didn't have any ties to their own country or Jeddah, and yet you were ordered to issue the visas, and your refusals were overturned illegally because the consular officer generally has the last word on who gets a visa. He said, what would happen if somebody came to you with a clean passport? And I thought, oh yeah, like the Iranian agent who ran the rug shop. And I said, I would have given them a visa. If they come to me with a clean passport, with no questionable answers to my questions, with enough documentation to show me what they're doing and why they're going to the United States, I give them a visa.
Now, for what kind of purposes were those visas used?
Well, they were brought, according to Joe, these guys came to the United States for training or orientation or debriefings or whatever. And then they were sent back to Afghanistan. In the course of researching the book, I found out that, there were some 10,000 of these people that came here, and they were given training at the CIA's facility called The Farm in Williamsburg, Virginia, and also in North Carolina at Navy training facilities. Additionally, in the course of researching the book, I found out through this book by Peter Bergen, Osama bin Laden I knew, that there were 52 recruiting offices in the United States, including Washington, D.C., that got Arabs and Arab Americans either to contribute for the war in Afghanistan or to be recruited and trained and then sent to fight as mujahideen.
Yeah. And now related to the time frame when you were working at the US Embassy in Jeddah, I think we need to say that the Afghan Arabs were used after the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union inside of the USSR, and then after it collapsed in 1991, they were used in the Central Asian republics and in the war in former Yugoslavia.
Yeah. A lot of this is covered not only in my own research, but in that of Peter Dale Scott, who wrote a book called The Road to 9/11. He talked a lot about this. And also this John Schindler, who wrote Unholy Terror. And Schindler is kind of a neocon and kind of a right-winger and kind of a government supporter. But in his book, he goes into great detail about bringing these guys to fight in Yugoslavia.
Yeah. And we also need to say that those guys were trained in the US during the 1990s.
Yeah.
And this is no conspiracy theory.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's Michael Parenti, the journalist and professor, talks about if you define conspiracy as secret activities perpetrated by a government and then covered up, and what they're covering up is essentially illegal, then there's conspiracies aplenty, like Richard Nixon and Watergate, like Iran-Contra, like the issues of the Bay of Pigs, where supposedly it was just dissatisfied Cuban emigres who wanted to fight Castro. Yeah, there's a lot of conspiracies. There was this one guy, John Judge, who died recently. He was quoted the other night as saying that he was called a conspiracy theorist, and he said his critics were simply coincidence theorists. So,
yeah. Did the U.S. Consulate in Jeddah play a role regarding the hijackers of the 9/11 attacks?
Well, according to the Los Angeles Times, and I threw the clipping away that I was sent, and I can't find it on their website, but 15 of the 19 hijackers got their visas in Jeddah. And in researching the book, I found out that the woman who did this was Shana Steinger, Steinger. And she was hired directly out of Columbia University with a master's degree as an FSO4, which is a very high rank for somebody right out of school with no background experience or training.
Yeah.
And she was supposed to have given very questionable answers to the 9/11 Commission investigating what went on in Jeddah. Yet she still has a job, and she's gotten promotions from what I've been told.
And after 9/11, you tried to talk with the FBI about it. To what success?
Joe, when I came back to Washington, and I had been fired before 2001, I tried talking to the Justice Department about this and got nowhere. And then after September 11th, Joe Trento said, why don't you call the FBI and tell them what you know? So I did. I called the main office and was passed from bureau to bureau to bureau, and finally said, look, you need to call our Washington field office, which I did. I called and was told that somebody would get back to me. And now, I guess it's 14 years later, I'm still waiting to be called.
Was 9/11 a blowback or something very different?
I don't think it was blowback. Initially, I thought, okay, these were people the CIA had recruited and hadn't bothered to share their travel plans with their masters. And the more I've read, the more I've seen, and this great silence I've had from everybody involved with the affair in Jeddah, I've concluded that it was more of a real operation designed to get the Americans more deeply involved in the Middle East than they had before. I mentioned on the Canadian Broadcasting Program, I got an interview late 2001, early 2002, from their show called Dispatches about this. And I had said, but look, it was cheap for the United States. There was 3,000 people killed. That's what was killed at Pearl Harbor and got the Americans involved in the war against Germany and Japan. This has gotten the United States bases in the Middle East it didn't have before. More money and more intelligence assets in the Middle East, greater and deeper involvement in the governments and cultures and societies in countries in the region. So I'm inclined to think that it was a calculated deal, working with the CIA and the State Department to get these guys into the U.S. and into this, and get the Americans back into the Middle East fighting an evil enemy. The Soviet Union, the axis of evil, the original axis of evil, I guess, had collapsed years before in December 1991, and the Americans didn't have any enemies anymore. Who are they going to fight? The Vatican? So you've got a huge military-industrial complex that eats up a lot of money, a huge intelligence system, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and a bunch of other organizations. Who are they going to justify? How can they justify their annual budget? So they needed enemies. And in John Schindler's book, Unholy Terror, he draws links between the guys the Americans trained to fight in Afghanistan and in Bosnia to destroy Yugoslavia to the September 11th hijackers. He names the guys who were planners, who were pilots, who were somehow involved in the operation.
As you know, there is, as the New York Times reported about it, a still classified section of the investigation by congressional intelligence committees into the September 11, 2001 attacks that has taken on an almost mythical quality over the past 13 years. 28 pages that examine crucial support given the hijackers and that by all accounts implicate prominent Saudis in financing terrorism. Now, what are your thoughts on this whole question?
Well, the United States likes to classify things. When I was in Jeddah, the price of liquor at the consulate was classified confidential, which is defined as the disclosure of which would seriously harm the foreign relations of the United States.
Okay.
So they classify all kinds of crazy things. They also classified part of the inspector's report on Jeddah when I was there, which is very peculiar. The communicator, Lonnie Washington, said he'd never seen that before. So with the 28 pages that are classified, it's either for a frivolous reason, and they can simply stop the controversy by declassifying them, or they're classified for a serious reason because it shows connections of the Saudis and maybe some Israeli operatives working in collusion with parts of the American government to bring about the September 11th attacks. We don't know, and we won't know until these people divulge the information. And as far as I'm concerned, as regards classified information, most of it isn't that classified, doesn't need to be classified, and in many instances should never have been classified. I say that the intelligence has a half-life of maybe 6 months, and after that, you can learn about it and nobody's going to die from it. I'll give you an example. My last assignment at State was at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and there we read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. We had access to restricted CIA reporting, restricted State Department reporting, National Security Agency intercepts. At the time, they had the peculiar coup in the Soviet Union in, I guess, about 1991. I was reading what was published in the daily newspaper and in the wire service reports with what was highly classified, secret and above, that was being reported by the State Department, the CIA, and the NSA. And the only difference I could see between the two was in the government reporting, they named names and organizations. So, that shows you how, classification really works against your own interests many times.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it interesting that in a democracy, the citizen is not allowed to see certain things that he pays for?
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, the Freedom of Information Act was opposed from the beginning by the executive branch. Lyndon Johnson, president at the time, threatened to veto it. The Justice Department always opposed it. And the law is very clear. You're allowed to see any document produced by the United States government as long as somehow it doesn't involve an ongoing police investigation, is involved in agency decision-making because they want the freedom to be able to make decisions without somebody looking over their shoulder, or something dealing with foreign affairs that can legitimately be classified as national security. And if you try to find, and you're allowed to find out what records the government holds on you as well, under the Privacy Act. And in practice, it is not the law of the land. If you want to find out about the nesting sites of spotted owls, as the Audubon Society once did, they sued the United States government and won. But in the case of me or other people who try to find out what was really going on, no, they're not going to tell you. And they'll stonewall you because they have more time, more lawyers, and more money than you do.
Is al-Qaeda some kind of useful idiot in a greater geopolitical scheme? I mean, you write in your book quite explicitly, and I quote now, "The international terrorists the United States recruited for wars in Afghanistan and Bosnia 30-odd years ago are still involved in the fighting elsewhere today. Bosnia wasn't the only place those saddle tramps and gunslingers were employed. The visas the State Department issued to them then are now tied to the current administration's continuing wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. The fanatics I saw get travel papers during my time at Jeddah are either directly involved in or trained those directly involved in fighting US forces today. Therefore, I think the question has to be, is the whole war on terror a fraud?"
Yeah, I stand by every word of that. I would say they were useful. I won't say they were idiots. they are perhaps not as well organized as the United States Marine Corps, but they have been carefully groomed and trained and aimed. Maybe they're not like rifle shots where you can hit a bullseye at 1,000 yards. They're more like a shotgun that you can kind of scatter things around and blow things up and hit things you're perhaps not aiming at. But yeah, they were fed and trained and armed and financed, and if they're not working 20 years later, they probably train people who are. I talked to retired Colonel Schaefer, who had spent a lot of time with defense intelligence in Central Asia, including Afghanistan, and I asked him specifically, are these guys that the Americans are now fighting, were these tied to the same people that were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan? He says, yeah, and it's either them or the people they themselves trained. I put the same question to former Senator Mike Gravel from Alaska, and he said, yeah, essentially the same thing. It's these guys are there, and they're America's creatures. They may not be under direct control, but they are controlled, and they are aimed, and they are useful to American purposes, which is essentially to keep the Middle East totally out of control, to eliminate any kind of threat to Israel by splitting Iraq into pieces. They haven't quite succeeded yet, but it's only a matter of time, I think, till they get the Kurdish north away, and then I think the whole country will come unraveled. But Iraq no longer is a functioning, viable country. It's a failed state. They've done the same thing to Afghanistan, and they've done it to Syria. Syria still has a functioning government of sorts, but the country is ravaged. I'm always sorry when I was in Syria that I didn't see more of the country than I did, because other than maybe downtown Damascus, the rest of the country has been destroyed by the Americans and these people they recruited, the al-Nusra Front, which the State Department lists as a terrorist organization, yet the American government supports and trains and arms. So yeah, I mean, they're useful, they're not idiots, and these are the same guys that fought in the Muslim republics on the other side of the Amu Darya River, and they fought in Yugoslavia, they fought in Libya, they fought in Iraq, and they're fighting in Syria.
Has the mainstream press showed some interest in your story?
Oh, no, indeed. When I came back, I cast around. I called the Washington Post. I had an interview one time with the Los Angeles Times after September 11th. And basically nobody's interested. Nobody writes about it, except George Jeddah for the Associated Press. And he spun the article saying that I had written an article that appeared in Covert Action Quarterly, which was a questionable publication, and added a sentence in there that, the State Department says that Mike Springmann doesn't have the entire word. The consular officer has the last word. Well, I was the consular officer, and only people with more information than I had and who had a consular commission could overrule me, and then they had to write an official report about the visa that was denied and then approved. So nobody wants to hear about this. I get interviews with the CBC, for example. Rai in Italy interviewed me one time. But the interest is mostly outside of the United States. Giulietto Chiesa had me interviewed for his movie Zero. I've gotten interviews for RT. I've just given one last Friday, and they translated into Arabic and put it up on their Arabic service just a couple days ago. But the Washington Post, NBC, CBS, CNN, they won't touch it with a 10-foot pole or a 12-foot Hungarian.
And why?
Because they're in bed with the government. The former CIA official, Ray McGovern, calls them the fawning corporate media. There's only 3 or 4, at the most 5, owners of news media in the United States. They want to keep their good relations with the government. They want to keep their good relations with their advertisers. They don't want to offend their corporate sponsors or their corporate owners. And they ignore anything that smacks of criticism of the government. I, in fact, a week or so ago, in fact, it was last Friday, I was sitting in a dentist's office waiting for a tenant to come out. He was having his teeth worked worked on, and I spent about 2 hours watching CNN in the lobby. And they were talking about the Iraqi government and its army fighting ISIS or IS or whatever they're calling it these days. And they went on and on and on about the Iraqi army and how good they were, and they talked about everything except the general geopolitical situation in the area. Why is Iraq supposedly fighting these people? What happened to Iraq? What happened to the government? Why was the government destroyed in 1991 and 2003? And they just simply ignore the basics and give you basically cotton candy.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for this interview, Mike.